It's so good to be here in Houston today, and we're at the home of William and Lois Kendall. And they have the distinct honor of being children of two of our longtime honored pastors. William's father was pastor of First Baptist Church from, what were the dates, William?
From July of 1907 to July of 19 to April of 1922.
So it was 15 years, just
15 years. And her father came in August of 22 and was there until December of 37.
So that was another 15
Another
years.
15 years. So between the two of them, they were there for 30 years. They had a pastorate of 30 years, the two of them did.
That is just wonderful. What was your father's full name, William?
William Bell Kendall. Now that's a B-E-double-L Bell. Some of his ancestors were named, the last name was Bell. So that was, he had the William Bell Kendall. Yeah.
Do you remember when they were born, when your dad was born?
Yeah, 1874.
When did he pass away?
In 1923.
So not long after he left the church, he passed away, is that right?
Yes, it was just the next year, too, after he left the church that he passed away.
Didn't your mother come back to Paris and live as librarian at the junior college?
They had thought that my father would be an invalid, and they were building a house there on Houston Street for him and my mother to live in, so he could live there for several years until he died. But he died in January of 23, and the house was only partially built. And so they decided they'd collected a good deal of money, and they decided to go ahead and build the house and give it to my mother.
The church did?
The people, yes, the people of the church. When they got to building the little house, the little cottage for my mother, the people who were building it, Albright, you know Albright, and he was one of them. Of course, there were several businessmen in the church, like Victor Albright. And he told my mother that if she could put another $1,000 down, they could build her a two-story house, and she would have rooms to rent upstairs. And with the cottage, she wouldn't have anything to rent.
Right.
So she had $1,000, she had $2,000. That was all the insurance my father had. So she took $1,000 of that and put it on, and they built the house two-story. And they gave her the four rooms upstairs. And then that was the wartime. So the soldiers were there in the camp. There's a camp there at Paris, a soldier camp. And this was, what year am I talking about?
The wartime came along a little bit later. At first she had school teachers there.
All right.
Yeah, the war was in the 40s.
Yeah, so she did rent to them when the war came along. But before that, I know that she had school teachers and different ones that had rooms there at her house.
And so the wives of the soldiers would come to Paris, and they couldn't converse with it. The soldiers weren't allowed to tell anything of what they were doing.
Right.
And they would rent a room for mother, and
well, she eventually made a little apartment or two up there, I think. So I think some of the men did live with them.
When did she pass away, William, your mother?
1950.
1950, so she lived that much longer than your dad.
Yeah.
Well, Lois, what are the dates of your dad and mother, their lives?
Well, they married in '98, and I don't know just when they. Well, they married in '98, and Mother was 19, and I think Daddy was 24. He was 5 years older.
But
So-
he was exactly the age of my father. They were both the same age.
Well, and your father was born when?
In 1874.
Was when he was born, and I guess if Daddy was the same age, I guess he was born the same time. I don't remember those dates, but I do remember that they were married, and I have their marriage license somewhere, so I know it's 1898.
And then he left First Paris in '38, and then he lived to when about?
They went to They went to Dallas first. He had, in those days, now they allow pastors so much money to buy their own home. In those days, the church owned the parsonage, and the pastor lived there. And so, of course, when they retired, they didn't have any place to go. So before he retired, he bought this 4-apartment house in Dallas, and they were going there, and he was going to do some supplying.
But he went from Paris to Shreveport.
Oh, that's right, he did. Dr. Dodd was pastor at First Baptist Church of Shreveport, and he traveled a lot. And he and his wife were going on a 3-month trip, I think about 3 months. And they wanted him to come there and live in their house and be the interim pastor while he was gone. So that's what they did first of all. They went there.
That was the first 3 months.
Yeah. And then I went on to Dallas. And I don't know how long they were in Dallas, maybe a year. And that was 38, so when the war came along in the early 40s, the pastor at Lancaster went with the army as a chaplain, and he just took a leave of absence. But while he was gone, he decided he wanted to continue being a chaplain, so he called back and resigned, and so then they called Daddy his regular pastor.
At
And he stayed there.
Lancaster.
When did he pass away, Lois?
Well, he was 80 years old. What year was it, Bill?
Honey, my mother passed away in 50, your mother passed away in 52, your father passed away in 54.
I think when he first left Paris, when they were living in Dallas there, he did a lot of visiting for Park Cities and getting it started and organizing.
Tell us about the church. There was just the sanctuary at that time. They had not built an educational building. Where did you go to Sunday school?
Seems to me like we went to Sunday school in the basement,
Okay.
but I can't remember. Seems like the classes were in the
Was
basement.
the parsonage right next door, just south
Right.
of the church, that 2-story house?
Right next door. See, Bill's father had built that after the fire.
Right.
And so, and I can't remember a lot about it. There was a vacant lot between our house and the church. And I remember that, and I don't remember a lot about the church. Of course, at that time, the church staff usually consisted, I've been reading this history that Marie somebody has written. And they did have educational directors in there, but what I remember is that Daddy and the custodian, one man, and then a church secretary. It was just about the staff. And then they did from time to time, they had educational directors there. So,
Who led the music, Lois?
Thetis Williams, she played the organ and led the choir too. She did it all.
Well, William, I know the fire occurred when you were in Paris. Well, I know that the church burned, and where was the parsonage that was burned?
The parsonage was next door to the church, and my father, I don't know, he got around and he did a lot of things, and part of it was building. I don't know what he did about it, whether he just hired people to build a house, but he moved that. I imagine he moved a little parsonage off of the property. They did that a lot.
Yes, sir.
And so then he built the 2-story house on that property before the fire. You see, that was before the fire.
Yes, sir.
And then when the fire started down there in the southwest corner of the city,
Right.
and started up, and we knew it was coming, Well, then my mother went upstairs and put things in
A sheet.
three sheets, and she had some linens, and she had some
Silver. She had a lot of silver.
silver. All right. Put that in the car, and we had them. There was a man there, a colored man who drove our car, and so she found him. He showed up, said, "Take the car and go out to the edge of town where there's no fire and just sit there with the car." Well, he took the car to his friend's house, and they unloaded all that and stole a good deal of that stuff.
Oh my goodness.
So that's what happened. Now let's don't dwell much on that. That was a lot of people bought clothes and things, valuable pictures of things, and put them in the church because they knew that this big church wouldn't burn. And so the fire came along and burned the church. But all that place across all the houses were burned all the way up to on our side of the street and the other side of the street and several blocks. The fire just burned up. So after the fire, my father had always had tent meetings in different parts of the town. He had a tent, and he would put the tent up for 3 weeks and preach there, and people would come, and he'd move the tent to another corner. So when the fire burned, when the church burned down, and all this, he had this tent that he used at different places. He put the tent up across the street from the parsonage, from the church, on that vacant lot there, and put sodas down underneath to keep it from getting wet. And so he must have taken a year to build a church. So we must have been over there a year. I know that, I don't know, I was cold that night I was baptized over there, and I was cold. So I don't know, I guess it was that same spring. Yes, and they worshiped there for 6 months or more.
Probably more.
And then, after they built a new church and moved over, took away the tent and the benches, and then they burned the sawdust. He put sawdust down on the floor, so it was time to burn the sawdust. And after he burned the sawdust, the nickels and dimes and quarters would show up under the sawdust, and that's why we got some money that way.
When was your home? You lived in the garage apartment then until he built the parsonage. When did they build that 2-story parsonage?
Well, you see, they already built one.
Yes, sir.
And it burned.
Right.
So they just built another one. He had columns. In the first house he built, big white columns that went 2 stories high. And that all burned up. And he couldn't repeat that. He had to build brick. He had brick columns. That's 4, 2 on each side or something.
After the fire, where did you live?
Well, my aunt was living in Terrell, and that was on this little railroad.
Right.
So we went down and stayed a week with Aunt True, and she had a new baby, and it wasn't very convenient for anything. But then my father built a shack on the back of the past parsonage lot, and we lived in that shack until he built a 2-story garage. And a 2-story garage would be 12 feet wide and 24 feet deep for the car.
Right.
And so and they had 2 rooms upstairs and 1 room downstairs. In other words, 2 12 by 12 rooms upstairs. And that's where we slept. And we had downstairs for eating and cooking and all that. And that's what my father did, and he did that pretty quickly.
And did you have electricity and running water in there, William?
Yes.
You had the
Yes.
utilities were back on then after the fire. They
Yes,
got the
that was.
utilities back.
Something I remember about the houses burning down,
Yes, sir.
and they wondered if the insurance companies would stand up and pay off, and the answer was that they did. The insurance companies paid off every house that was burned. They paid off somehow. I don't know who paid off, but anyway, they didn't have any trouble collecting insurance for the burned houses.
And of course, the church would have been insured, and the parsonage too, I'm sure. And well, I know you said that he had to resign in 1922 because of his health. Had he been sick long when he resigned, or?
2 or 3 years. I don't know. I don't remember him being sick when in 1912 to 1918. I don't remember him being sick. But before he got in bad health, it's nearly 2 years. He was sick nearly 2 years, I would say. I want to tell this quickly. A church called him in 1920, Cisco. And so he was packing up to go to Cisco, and the people in the church said, if you're just going to another church, we'll keep you here. And so they wouldn't let him go to that. So it was 2 years later that he went to Belton. He had a very good friend who was a superintendent of the Baylor Girls School.
Yes, sir.
And he got the church to call my father to the First Baptist Church at Belton. And that's where he was, and he couldn't walk at that time, so he was in a wheelchair. And he would roll up and preach his sermon from a wheelchair. And he wanted to build this pulpit. Maybe he'd stand up when he got to the pulpit. All right, build a pulpit with a wide pulpit to hide his legs. Okay, so that's what he did for 3 or 4 months. And then he came back to Paris, where he resigned from Belton and came back to Paris. And then my uncle, Emmett Reed, married his sister, my Aunt Margaret, and they lived in Baltimore. So he wanted my father to come to the hospital.
Johns Hopkins.
Johns Hopkins.
Johns Hopkins. And so he came down, and it seemed to be he made 2 trips up there, one in 1920 and one in 1922. And so in 1922, he went up there and he died there.
Oh, I didn't know he died in
Yeah, he died there.
He was 49 years old.
And so I remember being he was in the, where did they put bodies when they're home on a train? They put them on a cat.
Baggage car?
They put them on a cat in the car, yeah, in the mail car, some car, baggage car. All right. So then my mother and I came back on the same train, and so we got him out at Paris, and he was buried in the cemetery. Surely he was buried. The church had a cemetery lot that they gave to us, him, and that's where he was buried. And then my mother, that was 1923, 1950, my mother was buried there. And then Kitty was there.
Yeah, well, that was later on. That was.
Well, now, you finished high school then in 1923, didn't you?
I graduated in 22. Yes, I just barely got through by the skin of my teeth. I hate to think of how near I came to not graduating because Miss Adine Johns was an English teacher, and she didn't think I knew any English. So she was almost going to fuck me, but somebody talked her out of it. I graduated in May of 1922, and then I drove the car to Belton, where he was. I was only, how old was I in 22? 16. All right, 16, that's old enough. So I drove the car to Belton.
Were there any other staff members besides your dad, William? Did he have a church secretary? Did they have a music director? Were there any other staff members?
I think Miss Yancey was a secretary and everything.
Did they have a layman to lead the music, lead the hymns?
W.T. Guthrie was a singer, and I'm sure he was. Did you say that this woman was a...
Thetis Williams. As I remember, Thetis Williams was director of the choir. Now, she couldn't play the organ and lead the congregation too, but she was director of the choir.
W.T. Guthrie had a good voice, and he was a singer. And so I know that he had something to do with the music of the church.
Did you all have a Sunday afternoon youth group like BYPU when you were growing up, or did that come later?
I believe some of it came in there. And I remember going, but I didn't pay much attention to what I was doing.
Right. Well, now you moved into the parsonage, the two-story parsonage
Yeah.
of course was there. And do you remember, did they have any temporary buildings around the church? Of course, it was just the sanctuary then.
Well, of course, with the basement, we must have done an awful lot of things in the basement, because the basement is very familiar to me. Of course, the sanctuary for worship services.
Right.
But the basement was there. And I remember there was an entrance from our house across here, and then the steps went down to the basement. So I must have gone down there to go to Sunday school, because that seems to me like Sunday school rooms were down there, and then later on BYPU, and we did a lot of things in the basement. So that must have been our educational building in the basement. I remember that while I was still there, and when I was not much older than when I first went there, that I started teaching in the beginner department. And I was teaching 4-year-olds.
And I guess that was also in the church basement.
That was in the basement. I guess they must have had, they didn't have any other place for Sunday school rooms.
Unless they had some temporary buildings.
They didn't have temporary buildings. I don't remember any temporary buildings.
Well, I think it's just absolutely amazing that they were able to build a 4-story educational building during the Depression and pay for it. That was your dad's dream. I'm sure it was built during his past.
Well, I remember when he had the idea of building that, and that, educational building back there was not built to match the church very much. It was I think it was red brick, and the church was kind of a tan brick. I don't know, but anyway, he did do that. But I guess they had outgrown all the.
Yes.
And it was one of his specialties was paying off a mortgage and raising money. So Dick, our son, said he ran into somebody, and I don't know who it was the other day that was a member at Paris, and he said Dr. Wright was one of the best pastors we had, but not one of the best preachers. But you see why somebody would say that he was a good pastor. He was a good pastor because I was just telling Bill, he visited businesses in the morning. In the afternoon, he visited homes, but Mother had to go with him. He would not go to a home where there was a lone woman without taking Mother.
Right.
He was very particular about all of that. And so they went visiting every afternoon, and then nearly every afternoon I'd come home from school and they were not there. And then Mother would come in late, and she'd often go straight to the kitchen with her hat still on while she fixed dinner. But anyway, so he was, and they said that he first came down there and talked to the Lions Club, and they said, well, if the First Baptist Church doesn't call you, we will, because he was that kind of a speaker, and he loved to memorize poetry. See, he was one of the last self-taught preachers. he couldn't get a church anywhere today because with as little education as he had. But he was self-taught. He loved to memorize poetry, and he loved to, and he did have a good sense of humor. And he would start a talk and then bring it up to something, start with jokes, and then he'd bring it up to the real point.
Do you remember if there was there an active youth group when you were growing up, Lois?
Yes, there was. I guess that was a BYPU. Of course, later on it was a BTU.
Right.
And I noticed this woman calls it BTU when it was still BYPU.
Right.
But as I remember it, all the time that I was there at home, I don't know when it started, but it seems to me like it was there all the time I was in Paris.
Did you have Wednesday night prayer service? Was it in the sanctuary?
I think the Wednesday night prayer service, because I guess we didn't have supper then. We had meals there sometime. I don't know when we had meals, but we had prayer meeting every Wednesday night. But I don't remember whether we had them. There was an auditorium down in the basement, and I don't remember whether we had prayer meeting down there or upstairs.
Tell me about how you all dressed when you went to church.
How we dressed?
Yes. Very formally, I guess.
I guess we dressed up. We've all, as far back as I can remember, we dress up on Sunday.
Yes.
Means now that I wear a dress.
Yes.
But anyway, back there we didn't wear anything but dresses.
That's
but
right.
anyway, we always dressed up on Sunday.
Did you have a lot of emphasis on missions in the church then? Do you remember?
We had these missions organizations as far back as I can remember growing up. First I went to Sunbeam Band, and then I went to GAs.
Right.
And of course we had GAs in Paris.
Yeah.
So we had the mission organizations way back there.
Do you remember if you had pledge cards for the budget or anything like that?
I don't think so.
But
I don't remember anything like that. That probably came along later.
did they have envelopes then for the Sunday offering, or do you remember?
Surely we did. When did we have was it the 9-point system?
About the music, was there always a choir? Did you always have a choir on Sunday mornings?
Yes, we
Was
always
there
had.
a youth choir on Sunday evenings, or do you?
I don't remember much about youth choir. If we had a youth choir, I would have been in a youth choir because I love to sing. I never could sing, but I love to sing. And I would have been in a youth choir, and I don't remember ever being in a youth choir. So I don't remember that, but we always had a choir.
Right.
Even way back in Camden, we had a choir always, so there was always a choir and an organist. And of course, they used to, and I don't know whether they did that in Paris or not, whether they had electricity by the time. They used to have somebody in the back had to pump the bellows to
For the
make
pump
an
organ.
organ, but I don't know whether that had to do with Paris or not.
When the new sanctuary was built, William, that your dad built, did they put a pipe organ in when it was built? Do you remember?
I don't guess I remember. But it seemed to me that my mother had something to do with the pipe organ.
Yes, sir.
She received some money from her father about that time, and I think they put some of it into the organ.
Well, it sounds like that there was a really good spirit in the church during those years. The people coming together after the fire and rebuilding like they did, and just sounds like, and of course then during the Depression, which was a terrible time, that seemed like the people just really had a good spirit there in the church and worked together.
I don't remember anything otherwise.
Isn't that wonderful? I wanted to ask you about Vacation Bible School, Lois. Did you work in Vacation Bible School, or did they have it then?
I don't think we had Vacation Bible School. I don't remember Vacation Bible School in Paris at all. I don't remember it when I was there because I probably would have worked in it if it had been Vacation Bible, especially since I worked in the beginners department.
Well, do you remember revivals? How often did they have revivals?
Oh, we had revivals. I don't know how often we had them.
Did-
I'm sure we had them every year, and maybe more often. I don't know.
But I can't think of anything. Who was the man who held the revival, who came every year and held the revival?
The same one?
Huh?
We didn't always have the same one. But I think I know who you're talking about, but I can't think of his name either. But there were several. They all usually brought somebody in, evangelist, and they had the. And I remember even when my father was there, we had the tent across the street sometime and had for a revival meeting.
It sounds like there were a lot of advantages in growing up as a pastor's home, besides some disadvantages of having to move. And,
Yeah. Oh, there definitely were a lot of advantages. There are a lot of advantages in growing up in a good Christian home.
Yes.
Well, I remember that we went to church every Sunday.
Right.
We couldn't stay home and pay sick or pay anything.
Right.
Well, the subject never came up.
Right.
It was understood that you went to church when the church doors were open.
Yeah, that's right.
And I guess the phones rang a lot in your house, didn't it, with people calling you? Do you remember that?
Well, I remember one thing about, of course, in those days we didn't lock doors. But I know that the choir, the special music used to come to our house and practice, and the different things, the committees would come over there while the church was going on. You know, when maybe during Sunday school or between Sunday school and church, they'd come over to the parsonage because that was private, and of course the doors were open all the time. You could come and go, and there was a piano there, and they could come and practice the music. That was. Of course, there were a lot of advantages for a parsonage to be next door, and there are a lot of advantages now to pastors owning their own homes where they want them. Things change.